At this time of the year, you're supposed to learn about the Beis Hamikdash, and there are two reasons why we do it. The one is because this is the time of the year where we commemorate the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, and we're supposed to illustrate that bothers us, and that we wish the Beis Hamikdash was restored. So that's why we're learning about it, to show our enthusiasm that we'd like to have the Beis Hamikdash back. The other reason is because we're told that if there's a mitzvah that a person cannot physically fulfill for whatever reason, if you learn the laws of that mitzvah, then it's considered as if you fulfilled the mitzvah. So if we can't right now rebuild the Beis Hamikdash, if we learn about it, it's considered as if we have rebuilt the Beis Hamikdash. In addition to that, there always has to be a link between whatever's going on the calendar and whatever's going on in the parasha. So there's got to be some kind of a connection between at least something to do with the Beis Hamikdash and the parashas that we read during these 3 weeks. Now, we all know that the parashas, and certainly the haftarahs that we read during these 3 weeks, are linked to the idea of exile. For example, this week is a double parasha, and the second of the two parashas is called Maseh, which means journeys, which the sages say is a hint at the fact that we were kicked out of Israel and we had to journey through various places in the diaspora. So there's the link. But there also has to be a link between the parasha and the haftarah and the positive side of this time of the year, which is the restoration of the Beis Hamikdash. So we're looking for two things. We're looking to learn about the Beis Hamikdash with the hope that that hastens the restoration of the Beis Hamikdash, and we're looking to identify themes about the Beis Hamikdash and about the restoration that are somehow linked to the parasha as well. So, where we're going to start our journey today is with, firstly, a halacha about the Beis Hamikdash. We're going to start there, and then based on that halacha, we're going to analyze one part of the structure of the Beis Hamikdash that does not seem to follow this particular halacha. Okay? And from that, we'll get into a very intriguing conversation about the role of the Kohanim, which is linked to this week's parasha, with a very powerful lesson for ourselves, a lesson in the ability to reinvent ourselves. There's quite a lot of stuff that we're going to unpack. Let's start first with the halacha. So, unlike the Mishkan, the tabernacle in the desert, the Beis Hamikdash was built out of stone. Now, you could say that there's a very practical reason for that, because in the desert, when you needed a portable Mishkan, it wouldn't be very portable if it was made out of stone. So, logically, they made it out of wood, because that was a lot easier. You could dismantle it, you could disassemble it, you could pack it up, you could transport it. It was easy. The Beis Hamikdash, on the other hand, had to be a permanent structure. And in order to have a permanent structure, if you've been, for example, to the Kotel, or especially if you've gone down in the tunnel tours, those stones are permanent. I mean, some of those stones are massive, tons of weight. So it's really very permanent. Different to the Mishkan. So the Mishkan is very portable, and the Beis Hamikdash is very permanent. By the way, there's also another distinction on a more subtle level, and that is that wood grows. It comes from trees that grow. Stone is inanimate. So it is interesting that when they were in the desert, they used a Mishkan that was made from plant life, which had the ability to live and to grow, whereas the Beis Hamikdash was made out of stone that never had the ability to live and to grow. But that's subject for a different conversation, which we could have on another time. Here's the part that's really interesting. So the Mishkan was made almost exclusively out of wood. The Beis Hamikdash was made out of stone. And then the halacha is, and the Rambam says this very clearly, that in the structure of the Beis Hamikdash, you were not allowed to have any part of the structure that had visible wood, what he calls wood protrusions. Now, the words over here are very, very important, because he doesn't say that you cannot have any wood in the structure. He says that you cannot have wood that is visible on the external surface of the structure. So, for example, there's a verse in the Tanakh that describes when King Solomon built the first temple, the first Beis Hamikdash, and it describes that part of what he built into the structure were certain sections that had 2 layers of stone and then a layer of wood. So that implies that there actually was wood somehow in the skeleton of the Beis Hamikdash, inside the actual structure. But the Torah then continues to say he plastered over that wood so that you couldn't see it on the outside. So it's very clear that whatever wood there might have been in the construction of the Beis Hamikdash, had to be hidden from view. Had to be hidden from view. Okay, that's a very intriguing halacha. And in fact, there's a whole discussion in the Gemara, because we know that there were women's galleries in the Beis Hamikdash, because they couldn't have the men and the women together. So the whole concept of a women's gallery starts from the Beis Hamikdash, and there's a whole debate in the Gemara if the term that's used for porches usually implies that they're made out of wood, and the Beis Hamikdash couldn't have wood, so these were specifically made out of stone. Okay, so it's very clear that you cannot have wood protruding in the Beis Hamikdash. Fine. Now we know that halacha. Let's have a look at the piece of the Beis Hamikdash that does not seem to conform to that halacha, and that's really where our conversation will begin. So, all throughout the Beis Hamikdash, in different locations, there were different chambers that served different purposes. Some of those chambers were in the section that's called Ezras Noshim, which is the courtyard that was available to the public. That's why it's called the women's courtyard, because even women could enter that courtyard. Then you have a section that is called Ezras Yisrael, a very small section of the Beis Hamikdash, which was reserved for a person who was bringing a sacrifice and they had to stand and watch their sacrifice brought. And then there was a larger section which is called Ezras Kohanim, which is where the real temple service happened. And that was off limits to anybody except for a Kohen. So there were chambers in these various areas. Some of the chambers were completely within the Beis Hamikdash, and one or two of the chambers, like for example Lishkas HaGozis, which is called the chamber of the hewn stone, which was actually the supreme court of Judaism, that's where the Sanhedrin sat, it was not exactly inside the Beis Hamikdash, not entirely inside the Beis Hamikdash. So there were different chambers that had different roles in different places. One of those chambers is called Lishkas HaEitz, the wooden chamber. The wooden chamber. Does that not strike you as unusual? We've just learned that there's a halacha that you may not have any wood in the structure of the Beis Hamikdash unless that wood is hidden. So how then can you have a chamber that is called the wooden chamber? How could you have a wooden chamber? How's that even possible? So the first thing we have to just check quickly is what was the purpose of that chamber? And then we can come back and analyze the question of why it was a wooden chamber, how you could have a wooden chamber. So firstly, let's see what's the purpose of this chamber. So this wooden chamber, we're told, was really only used, it's pretty much only used once a year. What was it used for once a year? So seeing as we're not that far away from the high holidays, this is also a good thing to learn, not only because you're supposed to learn now about the Beis Hamikdash, but also because you're coming up for Yom Tov. So it's good to know, some of the key elements of the Yom Tov service. So we know that in temple times, the whole Yom Kippur service was built around the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, right? It was his responsibility to run the entire Yom Kippur service. And there were certain things that he did on Yom Kippur that you did every single day of the year, but usually other Kohanim would do it, and only he could do it on Yom Kippur. And there are other parts of the service that were only done on Yom Kippur, were very unique to that particular day. So the Kohen Gadol had to be trained up to be sure that he knew exactly what he was supposed to do on the day. There was a lot happening. There were many moving parts. And he had to make sure that he was on the ball. Plus, you also had to make sure that the Kohen Gadol was in a state of purity, because if anything happened to him and he was contaminated, he wouldn't be able to do the service. So because of that, they would take the Kohen Gadol, they would take him through a purification process, and then they would keep him away from the community for a whole week before Yom Kippur. So to put that into practical terms, he'd pretty much spend Rosh Hashanah with his family, and then the next day he'd go into isolation. And in that isolation, he'd be retrained, because the Kohen Gadol might have done this before, in the previous Yom Kippur, but he'd be retrained with all of the details of the Yom Kippur service. That place where the Kohen Gadol stayed, which was essentially the chamber of the Kohen Gadol, was called the wooden chamber. That's what it's called. It's called the wooden chamber. Now, all of the commentators, when they see this in the Mishnah, they ask the question, this is brought in the Mishnah in a tractate called Midos. Midos is the tractate that's dedicated to the architectural layout of the Beis Hamikdash tells us. Midos means measurements, so that's exactly what it does. It tells you this is how big each section was, this was the role of each section, gives you basically an architectural description of the Beis Hamikdash. So over there, it talks about this idea that the Kohen Gadol's office, for lack of a better word, or his little apartment, was called the wooden chamber. So all the commentaries want to ask, how could you call it a wooden chamber? We've just learned that you cannot have wood protruding anywhere in the Beis Hamikdash. How could you call this a wooden chamber? And they want to suggest various suggestions. One suggestion, which is a little difficult to wrap our heads around, but I'm just going to put it out there anyway, is that this particular chamber was actually in the section called the women's courtyard. So if you could picture the Beis Hamikdash, essentially the Beis Hamikdash is split into two precincts. You have the women's courtyard, and you have the area of service, which include the men's and the Kohanim's courtyard. Now, the laws around the women's courtyard were different to the laws around the actual, in a sense, the women's courtyard was, in a sense, a secondary level of the Beis Hamikdash. So therefore, there's certain restrictions that don't apply there. For example, there's certain types of impurity that you could still enter the women's courtyard, even though you couldn't go into the real epicenter of the Beis Hamikdash. So one of the suggestions is that if this chamber was in that section, maybe the law against the wood doesn't apply in that section. Okay, it's a little bit of a stretch, difficult to justify that opinion, but there is such an opinion.
What is the women's section used for?
All kinds of things. The women's section was used for many things. Basically, 99% of all your experience, if you went to the Beis Hamikdash, would have happened in the women's section. Because the only time you crossed over into the men's section was if you were actually bringing a sacrifice. So essentially, if you went to daven, let's say, in the Beis Hamikdash, or whatever it was, you'd be basically in the women's section. There were also various chambers within the women's section where a lot of the prep work was done for the Beis Hamikdash. Okay? But the service happened in the other section. Okay, so that's one suggestion. As I say, it's a little bit of a stretch, difficult to get our heads around. The other suggestion is that it was called the wooden chamber because at certain times they actually used to store wood in that chamber for whatever reason. Why I say for whatever reason is because there is another chamber besides this one that is designated for the preparation of wood in order to bring it on the mizbeach, on the altar. Obviously you had to have a fire consistently on the mizbeach, on the altar, and in order to have that fire, obviously you had to have wood. But one of the interesting things is that in order for that wood to be kosher, to go onto the altar, they actually had to check that it didn't have any infestation of insects. So there was a section that was allocated for that in the women's section. There was an entire section where Kohanim, it's interesting, this is the Kohanim who were disqualified from service, because there were certain physical characteristics that could disqualify a Kohen from service. So the Kohen who cannot bring sacrifices is sitting there checking the wood to make sure that it's not infested with insects. It's one of the jobs that they would do. So there's already a section that is allocated for the preparation of the wood for the Mizbeach. So it does again seem like a stretch to say that the name of the wooden chamber is because occasionally they used to keep wood in that chamber. Besides which, if it was a place for storage, then the way that you'd refer to it would not be wooden chamber, it would be chamber of wood. Because wooden chamber makes it sound like it's made out of wood, as opposed to chamber of wood makes it sound like it's used for wood. Okay, so basically the different suggestions made by the commentators all leave us still with a bit of a question mark, what's really going on over here? And so essentially most of the commentators conclude that this so-called wooden chamber had a substructure that was made out of wood, and then that was coated with plaster. So from the outside, you could not tell that it was made out of wood, but internally, the structure of that particular chamber was made out of wood. Okay? And technically, you could say that satisfies all the halachic requirements, because we saw from King Solomon that it's acceptable to be able to put wood inside the structure of the Beis Hamikdash, as long as it's not visible on the outside. And the Rambam's expression was that you may not have protruding wood. So this wood is not protruding. Okay? So we seem to have checked all the boxes and everything's fine, and this is halachically compliant. There's only one really, really big question that you have to ask, and that is, we know that there's a very big difference between doing something that is acceptable and doing something that is ideal. So if, for whatever reason, it's not ideal to have wood in the Beis Hamikdash. And the only way you could make that acceptable is if the wood is then hidden, like for example, it's covered with plaster. So then you've got to ask yourself the question, okay, so it is acceptable to have wood in this chamber, but surely it's not ideal. So why would we want to have a section of the Beis Hamikdash, small as it might be, but why would we want to have a section of the Beis Hamikdash that has wood in it that you then have to coat to be able to make it acceptable? Skip the wood altogether. Who needs it? The rest of the Beis Hamikdash is quite fine without wood. So what's the link? Somehow there's got to be a link between this particular part of the Beis Hamikdash, the role that it plays, and the idea of wood. It's got to be a link. It's got to be a connection. But before we get to that connection, let's make this a little bit more interesting. I mentioned to you that the wooden chamber is quoted in the tractate Midos, which is all about the structure and layout of the Beis Hamikdash. But where do you think you would find information about what the Kohen Gadol is supposed to do on Yom Kippur? Which Gemara do you think you'd find that in? The Gemara about Yom Kippur. Right? That's an entire tractate that is dedicated to Yom Kippur. It's called Yuma. And that's going to tell us the story of how the Kohen Gadol has to prepare and how he has to go into this quarantine for 7 days and what they're going to do with him while he's in quarantine and the training that he gets, etc., etc. That's all going to be discussed in the tractate Yuma, which means logically, in that Gemara, they must tell us where he's going to go for the week, right? So it does. Except over there, it does not call it the wooden chamber. In that Gemara, in Yuma, it says that for the week prior to Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol is going to be housed in a place called Lishkas. A Lishka is a chamber. Lishkas Parhedrin. That's what it's called. Parhedrin. It's a very unusual name. And that's where the Kohen Gadol was going to be for the week. We're going to see in a second what Parhedrin is. Right? That's where the Kohen Gadol is going to be for the week. So now we've got to ask ourselves, why do we have two names for the same chamber? It's a little confusing. In fact, it's so confusing that in the Mishnah, in Midos, we're going to hear that there's a sage called Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, who is basically the author of that tractate. Very often you have that a particular Mishnah is compiled by a particular sage. And they ask him the question. They say, we've heard about this thing called the Parhedrin chamber. What does it do? What's it for? And he says, I don't remember. Which is quite intriguing. Here's the man who's the expert on this particular area of law, and he is saying, I don't remember what it's for. So the Parhedrin chamber is like an unusual kind of, I'm sorry, not the Parhedrin. They're asking what the wooden chamber is about. He's the one that says Parhedrin. They're asking what the wooden chamber is about. He says, I don't know. I don't remember what it was for. I know the Parhedrin chamber. That's the one I know. I don't know this wooden chamber. I don't know what it's about. So the question is now, what is a Parhedrin, and how did this chamber get that name? So it would appear that Parhedrin is not a Hebrew word. It may very well be of Latin origin, even though, as we shall see, it has Hebrew roots. The word Parhedrin, we'll still see, has Hebrew roots. But it's not let's put it this way, it's not a word that is used in normal Hebrew conversation. It's a word that was used more by either the Romans, whoever it was at that time. A Parhedrin was a person who was in charge of the markets. So we know that one of the big things that the Romans introduced when they came into Israel was these big marketplaces, right? Even today you go to various places like the corridor in the old city in Jerusalem, you can see the old market, the Roman marketplaces that they used to, that they established. So Parhedrin was a government-appointed official who was in charge of running the marketplaces. And it was a position that was renewed on an annual basis. So the meaning of the word Parhedrin is somebody who has an official role for 1 year. That's what Parhedrin means. Somebody has an official role for 1 year. So the chamber where the Kohen Gadol used to go for that week of preparation for Yom Kippur is essentially called the chamber of the official whose Got to be replaced on an annual basis. Now, the minute you know that information, it immediately dredges up a little bit of the negative history of the Second Temple era. So what's the negative history of the Second Temple era? We know that the Kohen Gadol, to be able to go into the Holy of Holies, was a very big deal. Even though he's the Kohen Gadol, and even though it's Yom Kippur, to go into the Holy of Holies is a very big deal. If the Kohen Gadol was not of the caliber that he should have gone in to the Holy of Holies, then he would not survive the year. Sometimes they even passed away inside the Holy of Holies, and that's why the Gemara tells us that they reached a point in the Second Temple era where they would tie a rope around the waist of the Kohen Gadol, and if they felt the rope go slack, then he had obviously passed out or passed away, and they would reel him out. That's how bad it became. So they nicknamed this chamber the chamber of Parhedron, because they were replacing the Kohen Gadol on an annual basis. This is the latter period of the Second Temple era. So during the first Beis Hamikdash, they didn't have this issue, and for the first few generations of the second Beis Hamikdash, they did not have this issue. But once it became a thing that the Kohanim Gedolim were not of the caliber that they should be, and they were dying on an annual basis, so they renamed the chamber the Parhedron chamber. Now that's not a very nice name, if you think about it, and it kind of gives people the impression that you're taking a great risk if you're going to take on this role. So now we've got to ask ourselves the question, why did they choose such a negative name for the chamber? And we've got to ask ourselves, what is the symbolism and the distinction between calling it the wooden chamber, which was its original name, and calling it the Parhedron chamber, which became its later name? Once we start to explore that, you're going to start to find very fascinating things about what a Kohen is, about what a Kohen Gadol is, and about what happened on Yom Kippur, and all of that will have a very powerful lesson for us in terms of our own spiritual development, which we'll still get to.